our guest speaker come in. We will be recording the session and then posting it on our YouTube channel so you can go back and review it or share it with your other colleagues if you'd like to. And MZia was nice enough to coordinate with Dr. Boyd. And so MZia, I'll let you introduce him and I think we can get started. And I think you want to make this interactive, right? And let people ask questions throughout. Are you okay with that, Dr. Boyd? Okay.
Absolutely.
Great.
Yeah, so our today's speaker is Dr. Zach Boyd. He's the director of the First in the Nation Office for AI Policy here with the Department of Commerce. Correct me if I'm saying anything wrong, Dr. Boyd. So this group, under his leadership, they are developing or looking into developing regulatory policies related to AI applications here in Utah and hopefully maybe nationwide at some time. This is very, very fascinating because we are first in the nation, so we're very interested to hear what is in works, what ideas are there, and whatever you can share with us. I know not everything is ready to be shared, but whatever we can hear, there is a large group of people today. It's a great attendance, so let's make it interactive. We're in teams, so please raise your hand if you have a question. I'll try to monitor, raised hands, and maybe if Dr. Boyd doesn't notice, I'll interrupt for a minute. So let's make it interactive and see where we get with this discussion. The floor is yours, Dr. Boyd.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah, thank you guys for hosting me today. So I have some slides I'll go through, and I am pretty bad at seeing comments when I'm on slides. So MZia, I don't know if you want to actively interrupt me. That would be very helpful. Otherwise, I'll just stop occasionally to see if anyone has any things they want to say. Let me share now. Let's see. Okay, can you guys see this okay?
Looks great.
Okay, yeah. Fantastic. So yeah, I'll talk a little bit about Utah's approach to AI regulation. For background, I am a math professor at BYU. I'm on leave right now to run this government office, but my background is very academic. My research area is kind of at the intersection of mathematical modeling, machine learning, and social science. So things like computational psychology or computational neuroscience are really interesting to me. But right now I'm fully working on operating this office. Prior to BYU, I was at UCLA, Los Alamos, which is where they do nuclear weapons stuff, and Chapel Hill. So that's my background. I live down in Pleasant Grove with 4 kids. So let's dive into this. So I'll just set a little bit of backdrop, and I know some of this will be pretty redundant to you guys, but I think we can skip by those parts pretty quick. So why does the state feel like there needs to be some kind of regulatory policy around AI? I can explain some of the reasons throughout the talk, but as an academic, I'm aware AI is not new in the sense that we've been working on machine learning for 70 years at least, and it's been gradually integrating into a wide range of industries. I do think on a technical level, the last few years' advancement are significant. Language models really in the last 3 years or so have grown really tremendously in capability. Vision has been on a more gradual rise, probably since about 2012 or so, that it's really been getting very, very good. And this slide actually, I should probably update. I think advancement is not necessarily predicted to accelerate anymore. I think recent signs are that we are waiting for more breakthroughs. But even if we don't get really, really fast advancement of AI, there's a lot to be done, as I'm sure you guys are very aware, just in terms of integrating existing capabilities into all aspects of our society and making sure that goes well, and making sure we're kind of taking account as we go that there will be continued advancement. We're not stuck permanently, but we're just not on a hyper growth curve, in my opinion. And I'm happy to talk through that. But at the very least, when my office was being formed, AI was on just this incredible trajectory that was like, terrifyingly fast. Here's an example, if you guys haven't seen the data of the kinds of trends that we have been seeing. So on this chart, this is the length of tasks that AIs can do based on model release date and the length of a typical task that it can complete with a 50% success rate. And you'll notice both scales, well, the y-axis is logarithmic. So we're seeing kind of a constant doubling time. This, I think, has actually not slowed down yet. So this is still an area of fast growth. So, if you just kind of look a few years ahead, mid next year, you're looking at 4-hour long tasks. I've heard people talk about doing 10-hour long tasks already. But if you go a couple of years out, you're thinking about AIs completing weeks and months long tasks. For better or worse, no one really knows what the mechanism is for driving this curve. So it could run out at any time. We just don't know. So we are kind of dealing with this existential uncertainty about what AI is going to do and what it's not going to do in the longer run. Anyway, about a year or two ago, the government of Utah began basically a whole of government response to AI. And I hesitated to put this slide together because surely I would miss someone really important and, embarrass them. So I apologize for that. But kind of their top level governor and legislative priorities to get the work done. But then many, many agencies are working on various parts of the problem of how to respond to AI, whether it's workforce or public services or government data and things like that. My office is the primary regulator for AI. Now, we don't have enforcement authority. Our job is to develop regulatory policy, and we also have some hard authority to remove barriers to innovation in certain cases, and I'll talk about that. But kind of broadly, there were two camps that came together to create this office that I'm now running. And it is the first in the nation, and I think it's really distinguished Utah for being proactive and responsible for approaching AI and kind of for being a functional part of the nation in many ways. So basically, the first camp that promoted the creation of this office was kind of the consumer protection group that felt that social media was handled in a way that was really disappointing from the government's perspective. Like, it seemed like there was no plan, and now, these technologies are spread throughout society and various people are very unhappy with how they're operating, but it seems really, really hard to do anything about it at this point. So they thought it was necessary to have someone in government who was proactively looking ahead to make sure that when these technologies do mature and infiltrate through all of society, that we'll be happy with the result of that. And then second was kind of this innovation camp that said, AI fundamental changes in capabilities are also going to then create fundamentally new business opportunities and educational opportunities and public service opportunities. We need to make sure that the state is able to be agile in response to that. And I'll share later in the slide what that looks like. But the idea was that we needed ways to systematically learn when our regulations were being helpful and when they were outdated or when we needed to explore new approaches to them. So my office is kind of broadly speaking tasked with responding to that need, but to both of those articulated needs. AI regulation can mean a lot of different things in different contexts. I put on this slide some examples of the kinds of things that have been done in the last couple of years. I would say the easy part for most organizations is to agree on these principles that AI should be fair, equitable, transparent, and things like this. But no one really knows what that means in practice and how it should be operationalized for us. And that's the hard work, as you guys surely know. Federal government has kind of seesawed. They were very kind of worried about bias and things like this at first, and now they're kind of emphasizing deregulation and competition with China. The EU kind of went out very fast with this AI law that seems like it's going to face some challenges in reaching actual implementation. So it's kind of uncertain how aggressive that's going to be in the final calculus of things. Among the states, Colorado got a lot of attention for being very focused on bias. And I kind of, I think they've been doubting their decision about that more recently because there's been a lot of backlash for the way that they, are perceived to have been too heavy-handed and too vague about what exactly they wanted and required here. And then, California and New York have been on the national stage. If your metric of success is number of bills and intensity of the bills, California and New York is definitely the winners. This is not, the Utah approach, but they've addressed a wide variety of issues. A lot of bills have failed. You'll see on the news sometimes these stats of there have been 1,000 AI related laws in the last year. That's just not true. Like 90% of the bills related to this fail. And those that pass tend to be very incremental changes, like changes to the definition of pornography or like rules for how AI is going to be used in classrooms and stuff like that. That's not really, heavy hitting regulation on a grand scale. The way I think about the fostering innovation side of AI regulation is kind of in a maturation cycle of rules and regulations. At first, all of our governance is supposed to be grounded in moral principles. And those moral principles are supposed to be enacted through, at first, like emerging norms and promising practices, and then eventually into best practices that are kind of formalized and codified that everyone ought to do. And it's kind of at that stage, in many cases, that the government steps in by putting in legal norms that require the implementation of best practices. And then over time, you sometimes get the growth of like very, very detailed regulation, like in HIPAA or in parts of financial services and things like this, or cybersecurity, right? Where like there are just tons of details of what you're supposed to do. And one of the ways to think about how AI is affecting many industries is that our moral foundations are not changed, but now with AI, we don't have the best practices yet. And so we're in this awkward position where lots of laws are in place, but the best practices that are underlying the intent of those laws are kind of in question or still under development or rapidly changing. And so this puts us in an awkward position in government. So a lot of the focus that I have in the office is how do you accelerate the creation and normalization of best practices in industry? And that may mean, in some cases, dialing back some of these detailed rules in the case of AI for a period of time. And in other cases, it could mean putting more pressure on entities that don't really have an incentive to act in a best practices way. But those incentives have to look different because we still don't know what the best practices are going to be in every area, and it's likely to change rapidly. So that's one of the frameworks I use to think about this kind of problem. So I'll stop there in case anyone has any questions. After this, I plan on going into the regulatory relief program that Utah operates, which is kind of the pro-innovation, pro-flexibility side. And then I plan on sharing some examples of the more regulatory legal side of what we do. But I'll stop here in case there are any people who want to have questions, comments, or thoughts about this.
Could we do like 10-15 second rule to give everyone opportunity to scramble their thoughts?
Sounds good.
Feel free to ask questions, guys, if you have any.
Okay, if there aren't any yet, I'll get to some more specific stuff in a bit. This is all kind of abstract nonsense. Let's move on. I want to talk about our regulatory relief program. This is one of the things that I think is most unique in Utah's approach. And I'll tell you how I'm thinking about it and why I think this is a good idea and potentially useful for some of the companies that you operate, just depending on what needs you face. So basically, the regulatory relief program is an attempt to support innovative AI technologies by granting temporary regulatory relief to companies that want to use AI in an innovative way that may be in tension or just kind of not clearly mapping onto our existing regulations, under the condition that they are going to adhere to an appropriate governance standard that's kind of as a candidate for possible best practices in this emerging area, and that they will share their learnings with the government in some kind of a formal way so that we can get wiser faster in areas where there may be question about exactly how we should govern AI technology. So this is kind of a let businesses that are able to lead in this area with contact with the government so that we can learn from it. I'll give some specific examples of how this works in practice, but just to put in like very plain words, like my office has the ability to remove regulations on a case-by-case basis where that makes sense. And that's a uniquely powerful ability in the areas where Utah is regulating existing activities. So I'll share some examples of this. One that I think is pretty cool and interesting is this company called Dentacor. They offer a community dentistry program. And what that means is it's basically mobile dentistry for very poor people. I think 35% or so of their patients are homeless. And if any of you know dentistry, like the dental problems of that population are intense and very different from richer populations. And so basically, the CEO of this company came to me and said that basically, there are a couple dental disorders that are of interest here. I'll just describe one. There's this one called periodontal disease, for example, that in the homeless population is like a 75% prevalence. So most people who come in have this. And there are straightforward ways to begin treating this, but they said they were spending a lot of their money just on getting a remote dentist who's not employed by them on contract to confirm that the AI imaging that already identified the periodontal disease was correctly identifying the periodontal disease. And they basically said, this computer imaging is good, like the dentist, like whenever the AI and the hygienist agreed, the dentist was almost never disagreeing with what needed to be done. And so so they basically requested, can we, on a trial basis, cut the dentist out of this process, save a lot of money, expand our ability to reach this population. And we did a lot of due diligence in the background. We talked to experts on dentistry and computer vision and hooked them up actually with some academic resources that could support them in this journey. And our conclusion was that this was a really good trial to do. And we have authorized them to do this in the field. So the hygienists teaming with the AI are now able to do a part of their practice that previously only a dentist could do. And this is, making them more efficient and expanding access to care. So far, the test is going very well. And eventually, this trial period will have to end. They're sharing outcomes data with us so that at some point we can go back to the legislature and explain whether and how we think a long-term exception like this makes sense for our population dental health. So that's the first example. Oh, yeah, so they were going to run into all kinds of rules here. Anyway, here's another example. This one was much more complicated to deal with. So there's this company called Eliza Chat. They came to us a while ago. They've developed an AI chatbot that is supporting teenagers with common mental health related concerns. And, in this field, we did a lot of investigation about this field for other reasons, not just because of Eliza Chat, but there are all kinds of, shall we say, careless actors who are not taking people's mental health seriously and causing real damage. And so we scrutinized Eliza Chat's request pretty well, but they seemed very serious. They had a team of clinical advisors, they had escalation protocols, they had mandatory reporting requirements in place, HIPAA and FERPA, data privacy, all kinds of things. And so basically they said they would like to operate in this context, but there was a legal barrier they were worried about. Well, so the benefit is, it's actually really important for people to be addressing their mental health earlier and in a lower stakes setting, because there are all kinds of reasons people are not seeking professional mental health care with the frequency and abundance that they should. But they said they faced a regulatory risk. They were very unclear how this bot would stand with respect to professional licensure laws, right? Like we don't let a human engage in the formal practice of mental health therapy without a license. And so they needed to know from the state what we were comfortable with and how we thought we could proceed to understand, what could make a model like theirs work. So we looked at it, and basically after we introduced them to a bunch of experts and eventually came up with a deployment plan of, staged deployment. They would start with a smaller population and greater supervision, and then escalate to larger populations and less human supervision as their safety was proven over time on a schedule that we both felt comfortable with. And during this time, the Department of Occupational and Professional Licensure has agreed to forego most enforcement actions against them, with the understanding that they are in this experimental place and they're collaborating with the state to develop better standards around this kind of deployment. A third example. So this is a little bit different. So those of you with kids in schools may know or may not know that Utah code requires that school districts make available all learning materials to a parent to view and also post the materials online, and have 2 public hearings of the board to hear from stakeholders before they can approve any educational material, which, is in some sense good governance practice. But the problem is that they were trying to deploy these generative AI solutions, and multiple superintendents came to us basically saying that they were unclear how to comply with this code in the case of a generative AI tool, because you just couldn't know everything necessarily that would come out of it. And basically they felt like they were stuck, and we didn't have a super great long-term regulatory answer for them. That really would require an act of the legislature to make totally clear. But we worked with educational professionals to basically create an exception for them on a temporary basis that says a local school board may use AI if the materials have been rigorously evaluated by a qualified third party, and that equal consideration of benefits and risks to students is given, and that parents have an opportunity to engage directly with the AI. So in this case, I don't know that we relaxed standards in any way. We just kind of created a pathway to compliance for them in a case that was just not clear to them how they could comply. So I think that was fairly successful. If there's time, I'll give one more example. This is kind of more reflective of the typical case of companies that come to us. There was a company that wanted to deploy remotely driven vehicles. So these aren't exactly self-driving cars because there's a remote human operator. And this company asked if there was any mitigation needed for this kind of thing. And in this case, like in many other cases, we contacted other regulators and other experts in this area. And basically, everyone we talked to said, it seems like there's no law against this. We really don't think there's any barrier to them proceeding. So we just wrote back to them and said, no one sees a problem here. Just go ahead. And you're just subject to the same laws as everyone else. So no regulatory mitigation was needed in that case, but I think we found in many cases it's just kind of useful for there to be a point of contact in government who is able to, just articulate that to you as a stakeholder that it's okay to go innovate, and we don't think there's a problem in this kind of a case. So anyway, if you or anyone around you thinks that you might be a good candidate for this program, we have a broad range of regulatory tools we can apply to give people more space. For example, we might not alleviate any law, but we might say you have a certain time period to cure any harms caused before regulators get involved. Or we might say there will be a limitation on how many fees you would have to pay if there's a lot of problems. Or anyway, there's all kinds of flexibility we have to operate. And we operate in a very kind of informal, small business friendly way, in the sense that if people want to work with us, it's literally just a phone call and an original meeting. And then the office goes back and conducts due diligence to make sure we're comfortable with the deployment plan that you propose. Sometimes we have gone back and say, hey, there's still one or two issues of concern that we think would have to be addressed. But then you go out and execute, and we collect the data that is mutually agreed upon to be shared, so we can understand what is to be learned from these initial innovative AI deployments. And eventually we report to the legislature to make sure they're informed and updating the laws. We might make very specific recommendations for how we can create pathways for AI deployment that are consistent with Utah values. So I'll stop there. That's the regulatory relief part of my presentation. I'm interested in any comments or thoughts anyone has at this stage.
Yeah, we have a hand, Dr. Boyd. Ken?
Right.
Yeah, specifically with respect to the public education exception that was made, I'm thinking about the way that was worded, and the thought came to mind is, how is this uniquely or distinctly different from other things? For example, just the internet, right? You obviously can't provide all the content of the internet for review and for all these cases. So what was it, just an abundance of caution? They wanted to follow this, get the ring kissed, so to speak, or I mean, what was the qualifier that led to them to seek a special, waiver, or whatever you want to call it, exception?
Yeah, no, I think that's a valuable question. And I frankly am kind of in your camp. I don't think there's a problem here, but I do sympathize with the principals and superintendents who are going to get these calls from parents who are going to be complained at and who just
Sure.
like are in an environment where they have to be paranoid. And if you actually look specifically at the internet, which I think is a really good analog, honestly, we had lots of conversations, not just for this project, but for other things where we've been working with the school board, that like the internet is also like generative AI in the sense that anything is in it. But it took the school boards, the schools, a really long time to figure out how they were going to respond to the internet, right? Like at first they tried to block it, and then they tried to, teach about it. And now they just, I guess, are at a place of acceptance and a culture's developed. But so yeah, I think this just gave them the freedom to accelerate a little bit and feel like they had permission from the state to like try things that were sensible. Does that make sense?
Makes sense. Yeah, oh yeah, totally. I understand. I just wondered if there was anything additional context other than
No.
I want to feel safe taking the chance, so to speak. So,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
Alex, you're next.
Yes, thank you. I'm curious on that question around the healthcare exceptions you were making. I really find those innovative and useful, both in the mental health and the dental. One of the challenges in healthcare is around rural healthcare, and access was a big issue here for our state and many states. How do you look at um, these exemptions relative to all the federal rules? Because it's an area that, quite honestly, is a huge impediment to innovation in healthcare. And then there's all these different stakeholders that are trying to guard their cheese and not have it moved or evolved. So, if an organization wanted to, follow this framework for what you described in healthcare, and in these two examples you've given, what are some kind of rules for the road or ways to think about it? Because there are a lot of interesting healthcare opportunities for innovation, but then there's all of these potential federal law barriers that are out there.
Yeah, no, we've thought a lot about this issue and we continue to explore it. I mean, the thing that made the Dentacor and the ElizaChat cases really plausible was first, Dentacor is very locally operated. And so just because of their business model, so they were happy to work with a Utah regulator there. Generally, the division of labor is states handle scope of practice and how professionals conduct medicine, and the federal government handles medical devices and federal insurance and hospital administration. And so, yeah, there are like problems that can happen. They just happen to not apply to this case or to ElizaChat, because the primary regulators of ElizaChat actually are the schools, right? Like just schools are in a different environment that way. And so it just worked out in that case. We have relationships increasingly with the federal government that is interested in kind of creating a parallel structure to this. So in the AI action plan that the Trump administration put out, they said it was a mandate to the agencies to engage in similar kind of exception making practices here. So we're starting to develop those relationships. A couple days ago, Senator Cruz introduced a bill to formalize a federal AI sandbox that's corresponding to the state sandboxes. So that's kind of coming along. But yeah, I mean, sadly, this is just the reality, right? That like federal agencies are going to do what they want due to their own incentives. So the easiest partners to work with in terms of you don't need to engage the federal are those with a substantial stake in doing things in Utah. But it depends really case by case. If you know a lot about this, I'd be very happy to talk more about it, because we are trying to figure out how to make this smooth and efficient.
Yeah, we would love to have a follow-up conversation with you. So I'll try to find out how to connect with you here.
Yeah, well, and you can just email at ai@utah.gov and it will get to me pretty rapidly. So we can start a conversation that way.
So AI
at utah.gov. Yeah. And any of you can email there. Like each industry has its own complexities and we're trying to be pretty aware of as much as we can.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Any other questions, comments, thoughts?
Yeah, we have Scott and then Guy.
Yeah, thanks. I have a question kind of about how you're providing governance or encouragement around the educational system's adoption of AI, not just the concerns and resistance, but like, for example, my daughter's in the graphic design program at USU, and they're forbidden to use anything like that, which is ensuring that she doesn't have basic skills and will not be competitive in the job market, she graduates in the next year. It's really kind of
Yeah.
crippling them, and they're just avoiding it so bad. And even I know there's issues with like writing papers and such, but it seems like there should be uh, how you embrace that and still allow for the benefits of that and the training that's necessary, and just being able to use what's in the real world now.
Yeah, yeah. I really sympathize with that. I've had so many conversations with all types of educational professionals and students and people in the workforce about this, and it's really sticky. In some sense, it's more of a cultural problem than a technical regulatory problem in some ways, because it just will take people time to do this. But I think the state's role in this tends to be more of articulating our values and our priorities for our public institutions. Sometimes saying that we expect them to be agile and change what they do. Some of this is funding allocation. There's certainly talk about where exactly we should fund which parts of the schools and how we should phrase compensation to make sure that they are being more agile. Part of it is just empowering the disruptors, right? There are mechanisms in the state government that are designed specifically to fund people who are breaking the mold here and empower them within the system. But it's tough. I will say this is one area where I can't share everything that is in process. It's become a governor level priority because he thinks that the system will not necessarily adapt unless we take pretty intensive action. But yeah, we're still kind of figuring this out. It's a multi-agency problem too.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, wish I had better news for you there. But I mean, it's like we're like very, very aware this is a huge priority.
Yeah.
Hey, Scott, on October 10th, we have another speaker, the Chief of AI Officer of the University of Utah, Dr. Manish Parashar. So you'll have another opportunity to ask your question.
Well, and I love Manish. He's a very, very innovative guy, and he's got a lot of influence in the University of Utah.
Do we have time to a couple more questions, or do we want to move
Sure.
on and leave some time in the end? Because I have Guy and then Ed.
I think we take time. We have 25 more minutes, and I can extend or contract the last part as much as we like.
Guy, you're next then.
Okay. So Zach, I was wondering how this fits. There's an Office of Regulatory Relief that does a sandbox similar to what you described. Are you guys hand in glove? Are you underneath that umbrella with your regulatory relief, or how does that work?
Yeah. So we're two separate entities, and there are cases where, in some cases, either one of us could handle things. The Office of Regulatory Relief can handle things not related to AI, which is not true of us. We need an AI tie-in. But on the other hand, I think it's fair to say we have more flexibility than they do, more autonomy, because when you go through the Office of Regulatory Relief, as I understand it, you have to apply for a waiver of a law or a non-waiver of a law, whereas we have more flexible authority to do things besides waive laws, right? So like basic consumer protections, we would never waive, but we might cap fees or we might give you a cure period. So you're still operating within the law, but there's just kind of a formal regulatory forbearance or regulatory accommodation. So I think that's one difference that's been really helpful for us, is just being able to, because our purpose is not really to, our real purpose is to develop best practices and not hold people back while we are developing those best practices. So I would articulate the difference that way.
And kind of a follow-up on that, then do you have the converse of that authority? Like if somebody's really being a bad actor, do you have the ability to raise that? You're not law enforcement, but yeah, what do you do in that case if somebody comes and you're like, oh, well, you thought this was going to be okay, but this is actually really dangerous. You should do something.
So I mean, Yeah, so we put terms in our contracts to make sure that we can step out of these arrangements if there is a problem with someone who's come to us. Our general presumption is that if they come to us, they're good actors, because it's not that hard to evade our notice most of the time. Mostly we do think that. But for better or worse, the legislature, I maybe for better, has made the decision, like you said, to not give us a formal enforcement authority. Instead, we work with and I'll talk about this in the second half of the presentation, about how we work with the legislature to address specific gaps in law and gaps in enforcement to make sure that we do have the right consumer protections in place. So for better or worse, that's a slower process. This kind of tends to be the case when you're taking things away from people through the government, right? So that's where things stand.
Thanks.
Okay, well, I'm going to jump off the previous comment about the university student being restricted. I work in public education, so I work for Granite School District, and
Great.
I just learned that we will be piloting, well, the State Office of Education has been piloting a new AI program course in the second semester this year. And so we will start seeing some of those changes moving forward. But when I work with my advisory boards, that's been one of the topics of large discussion, if you would, because it is affecting those that they're hiring, right? I mean, it's influencing our workforce. And so that being said, where do we see this happening? Do we see more adjustments coming in the public school? Because obviously at the post-secondary, we're dealing with adults, but in the secondary and elementary areas, we're dealing with youth, right? The minors. So
yeah. So are you just kind of asking generally, like, how would you think we're going to strategize about K-12 as a state with AI?
yeah, I mean, obviously you have a very large component to be discussing. Is there anything specific that is being discussed in the K-12 space that?
Yeah. And so I work with the state school board a lot, and with some of the school districts when they ask for help. And I mean, they have the state school board. I don't know if you know Matt Winters. He's their specialist on AI, who's very, very good and active. So he could tell you more about the plans than I can. But generally, we're doing a lot of teacher education. I think we're pretty committed at this. All the people I've talked to at the state are fairly committed to the idea that AI is not going away. We do have to figure out how to educate. So some of the discussions I'm seeing are really about teacher training. The sense is that the teachers can't lead on this if they don't understand it. Some of it is on new educational pathways to create training that is specific to AI. And these, different school districts are handling this differently, but also the state school board is developing them. I think there's a little bit less consensus around how you think about the risk calculus with kids. I mean, obviously, it's bad for kids to be exposed to inappropriate material and bully each other and things like this. I certainly know people who've been subject to that. But on the other hand, I always tell people sometimes governments kind of immediately go to a risk-only calculus when you need to be doing a risk-benefit calculus. And sometimes thinking of the benefits in the context of the risk can change the answer. I'm working with some folks just beginning to work with in special ed, where like there are risks to mental health with AI, but there are also potentially substantial benefits with extra individualized attention and models that are specialized to the particular challenges those students are facing. And then the other conversation we're having a lot is about durable skills. How do we transform what we're going for? I kind of have advocated that these technology shifts kind of mean that we need to put more effort on human skills and less effort on like kind of more rote knowledge kind of skills and things like that. Not a wholesale abandonment, but just kind of a relative shift of those priorities. Anyway, hopefully some of that is valuable to what you were asking.
Thank you. I do. And I agree with you. Thank you.
Yeah, happy to correspond too if you guys see anything that I could be of help with there. And also if there's anything I can learn from what you guys are doing. Okay. Shall I go on then? Are we okay?
Yeah,
Great
looks like we have
discussion.
no more questions.
Okay, so that was the regulatory relief program. So that's one of the two things we do. The second thing is a learning laboratory, which is a much slower mechanism that prepares policy recommendations for the legislature to be passed into law. And so we work with a stakeholder-driven model and try to absorb as much knowledge and best practice from the community as we can. And then we work with specific legislators to run specific bills that are relevant to the state. And these could be kind of increasing consumer protection kind of laws or kind of clearing pathway laws. And I have 3 examples I can share with you that are interesting. There are others I could share, but we'll just stick with 3 for now. So I prefer depth over breadth here. So I've got all the pacing out on these slides. Sorry about that. Anyway, the first one we did was last year. We talked about mental health AI. And when people talk about mental health AI, sometimes they mean more consumer oriented, informal mental health, and sometimes they're talking about more formalized institutional mental health. Here we're talking about more formal mental health products. And if you think about it, AI is kind of the tip of the spear for language models going into healthcare. It's just obviously so linguistic and so much about the kind of communication that AI is good for. And so we worked with just tons and tons of stakeholders. I mean, I probably interviewed, I don't know, 300 people or something with different expertises, and my office also to explore this topic. And this was a year ago, but it was already clear that AI was going to be transformative in the mental health space. I'll just share some broad observations. I don't have time for the whole thing, but for example, we found that mental health professionals as a general rule were very uneasy about AI. They're very much in a safety culture, in a caution culture, and so that made sense from where they were at. But your average person, and including people with lived experience, was much more optimistic about AI and felt empowered by AI as a way to cope with their lives and just understand themselves in a less formal way. And then there were also kind of innovators in the mental health space that really thought that AI should be part of the institutional provision of mental health care. The most obvious case is these clinical note-taking devices, which are very popular, but also these, let's see, do I have something on the next slide? Yeah, I have some example use cases on the next slide. People are very interested in just-in-time mental health support. So, the fact is that phone-based apps and other AI tools are 24/7 available, and that really can change the game in some cases. It's been a dream for a long time to reach people when they need help rather than when they're able to come. Then there's kind of homework and skills building applications. So I talk to entrepreneurs who are building things that help you on a daily basis practice cognitive behavioral therapy, things that you're learning in your clinical practice. Then there's big triaging efforts and scaling up efforts to try to make sure that we're seeing the right people at the right time in the right order. And then just, the therapist in your pocket model kind of underlies a lot of these things. And in the future, we're thinking this becomes more audio and visual, more widespread, and very interestingly, a source of enormous data on mental health. And we'll see how that goes. And we do expect the technology to continue to improve. So anyway, we identified a number of problems and opportunities in this first agenda. On the consumer side, we found 3 risks that seemed addressable at this time and important. So for data privacy, it turns out for various reasons, these are not, if these are going direct to consumer, they probably are not subject to HIPAA data protections. And so we filled that gap in state policy. We were also seeing an incentive for people to serve targeted ads based on your mental insecurities, which we thought was not the future we wanted to head towards. So we put a legal restriction on that. And then just transparency about when you're dealing with an AI. From our business innovators, the main feedback we got was there was no clear pathway to compliance. And what this meant is that we found that a lot of people going into this field were systematically the less scrupulous people. And so it was kind of creating a race to the bottom in the field. So we worked with a lot of professionals to develop a safe harbor for developers following best practices so that our professional licensure folks would have a formal duty to forbear from enforcement against good actors in this space who could document their adherence to best principles. And so our hope is that this kind of stops a little bit the race to the bottom of this field and helps the people who are responsible feel like they can go in and they have a pathway to apply their expertise here. And finally, for therapists, the feedback was largely that they just didn't know what they were allowed to do. They didn't understand AI. And so we worked with community leaders to develop a comprehensive guidance letter explaining some of the common mistakes that were made and some of the places where we as the state felt it was very appropriate for therapists to innovate and try new things. And we've gotten really good positive feedback on that. We're now like the clear national leader in AI governance in mental health, I would say. So that's the first learning agenda item we went through. So that passed into law in the last legislative session. Anyone have any thoughts or comments or questions on this one?
Just real quick, I mean, I often tease people that AI is my favorite little delusional sociopath. Was there any concerns from a mental health perspective that AI, by definition, is mimicking emotion and it's confident even when it's lying? How do you manage that from a mental health perspective, or was that even something that's been considered at this round of the process?
Oh, we had endless conversations about this. This is a really big deal. And I think we set the safe harbor pretty well here. So basically, here's how I would analyze it. So yes, sometimes there are harms, like you said. AI can be sycophantic and harmful in various cases. I will say, like, the range I saw between the people who are very thoughtful and smart and careful in this space and the kinds of AIs they were producing versus, just grok or whatever is very, very wide, right? And so we did find that with care and proper diligence, you can really, really improve the capabilities of these models and the appropriateness for use in mental health. We have laws already in place that we think are pretty good for people who are harmed by mental health AIs, in the sense that there are private rights of actions, there's consumer protection enforcement, there's professional licensure enforcement, and that's just at the state level, and also criminal enforcement in some cases. So we think that's pretty well covered. But if you kind of open up inside the safe harbor specifically, I mean, what is required in there is pretty intense, in the sense that there has to be the involvement of a clinical advisory board, pre-deployment proof of safety, ongoing monitoring and escalation protocols. Like, there's this whole suite of things. And the standard we set is you need pre-deployment proof that the safety of your application is not worse than the safety of a trained human handling a similar situation. And so it's a very, very high standard. It's actually kind of like a grand challenge for the industry that they're welcome in here if they can actually do so responsibly. And we think that's pretty responsibility. So that's kind of how we're thinking about the issue. We'll see, this was a first in the world law like this. We'll see if it's wrong and if we need to change it at some point.
Sure. Oh, that's great.
Other thoughts here?
What kind of training for law enforcement agencies do you have for this? It seems like a very different type of a law than your typical law that we have on books.
Yeah. Well, so what we decided to do is the typical enforcers for this are going to be the Division of Consumer Protection and the Department of Professional Licensure, right? And so both of them are well aware of the law. They helped craft the law, and the department heads are aware of the spirit of what we were trying to accomplish. So in that sense, because this is just for Utah, it was pretty easy to get the enforcers. I suppose, yeah, I think it's just not normal for police, like frontline law enforcement, to be the enforcers of these things. So it just didn't come up that much in this particular case.
So as a Utah law, though, help me understand, if the app's built in Utah or used in Utah, does it apply? If I'm a Utah
Yeah.
resident, am I protected, or is it if I'm a developer in Utah, I have to follow the rules if I'm developing for other states even?
Yeah, so the enforcement of the law by default is for all transactions that happen in Utah. So it's protecting Utah users, and in the case of the safe harbor, businesses during their operation in Utah. Right, so even if they're developed abroad, if you want to do business in Utah with your app, this is the regulatory framework that applies.
Okay, so if I sell to a Utah resident, not if I sell it on the App Store and the transactions in San Jose, California, Utah residents get the protection from this law.
Exactly.
Okay.
Other thoughts here?
How
Okay.
do those regulations become known for developers outside Utah that they need to comply and potential implication of their work?
Yeah, I mean, this is always a challenge, right? Is how do you know? And frankly, some of these things are open source, and like ultimately we're going to have trouble controlling them. But most respectable entities keep pretty good tabs on laws throughout the state, so we don't think there's going to be a lot of problem here. And fortunately, like spiritually, I think a lot of this is fairly aligned with what professional, the people in this field who we consider responsible are going to do anyway. We tried really hard to do this, to make sure the law would impose no additional burden on the most professional people who really were thoughtful in this area. So I don't know, it's kind of an imperfect system, the same way when I drive through Draper, I don't know exactly what the Draper traffic laws are, but usually common sense gets me through. Sadly, I just think this is the world we live in. It's a great question, though. And this is why some people advocate for a federal standard on all of these things. We're just waiting for the Congress to actually do that. Other thoughts? Well, maybe I'll proceed then. I think we've got, I should just go to the top of the hour, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so we'll just see how far we get. I have plenty of material, but we don't need to go through everything right now. Let me share in a little bit different area. So deepfakes are really, really important for the average person in all kinds of ways. So we've got various commercial harms, non-commercial harms, and then just subjective harms that we thought were important. We've done a lot of research on this area because it's a top priority for the average person within AI. It's a bit of a challenge to think of how to make the situation better from the government's perspective. We do have laws in place already that criminalize various uses of deepfakes or impose civil liability, and that's great. But what we really need is something to give us an environment where there's a greater baseline trust, right? We're finding that, people really hate having to live in a world where they question whether everything's a deepfake. And so anyway, there's existing regulation here. But really for this learning agenda, which is going to be a subject in the next legislative session, we're developing the bill right now. We think we need to help the good guys identify their own content as real. And for that, there are a number of promising technologies. One seems particularly appropriate for the state to have an involvement in. I'll have to go kind of quick here. So not everyone will necessarily understand the next part, I think. But there are examples of trust architectures that have become really widely used that protect average people without a great compliance burden on ordinary people. So HTTPS is a very standard example of this, where your browser and the infrastructure you surf the web on is constantly protecting you against people who are impersonating other people. So there's, I think many on this call will know how HTTPS works, at least on a basic level. And so there's a huge industry movement now to create similar protocols for image-based and audio content to basically cryptographically mark that it is authentically coming from an AI source or from a known non-AI source, or modified by a known AI modification source. So the analogy that I tell the average person is that what the industry is favoring in this area, or large parts of the industry, are basically tamper evidence seals on data, so that you know what has touched it and what has not. See, my pacing's all wrong on these slides. Anyway, so lots of companies are getting together. So kind of the image of what is likely to happen in this field is companies that originate content, like OpenAI and Sony, are going to be automatically putting cryptographic tagging on data that shows that their company or their product created the content. The Photoshops of the world already are beginning to deploy protocols to modify the cryptographic tagging when upon intake time, to show that Photoshop modifications have taken place. And then the social media and others who display the content are exploring the right ways to display and inform users and warn users as the case may require, so that it's really transparent whether what you're seeing has a physical source, a purely artificial source, and to what extent it was modified on the way to seeing your eyes. And so the idea is this creates transparency, and that people will begin to rely on this over time, just like we rely on HTTPS. Even though most of us don't know what it is, it's it's baked into the infrastructure. And so we think this is really good. We are exploring right now with the legislature exactly what the legislature will want to do to enforce or to support or enforce this at scale, because we think there's a huge public benefit for our constituents. The obvious thing is for Utah to certainly lead out and adopt these kinds of content credentials in their own communications, required in our tools, in our critical operations, and things like this to increase trust in government. There are questions about whether some actors in our ecosystem should be required to have compliance with these kinds of protocols. These all are being developed in open source, easy to implement ways, same level of difficulty as complying with SSL or something like that. So we're talking about whether there should be requirements on social media companies or AI companies or editing software or other companies, whether there are penalties for deception in kind of hacking this kind of metadata and protocols. And also we're thinking about how Utah should engage on standards development. It's Utah was asleep at the wheel, and most governments were asleep on the wheel when the fundamental building blocks of modern information technology were laid. And so we're thinking about how we can actually stay informed and active and make sure that we're comfortable with the future that's being built on top of these protocols. So anyway, we don't need to go super deep on this, but this is a second kind of policy area we're looking at. Another one for this session is we're looking at AI companions and kind of the consumer harms associated with that. But I'll stop there. We just have a minute and a half left. Maybe some people have comments or thoughts here. In any case, I just wanted to thank you guys for your attention and for engaging with the government on this. I mean, we're trying to be good partners and make sure that we're building a future that is prosperous and that Utah citizens can be comfortable and happy with. So with that, I'll thank you for your attention and welcome any final questions or thoughts you may have.
On that provenance data, it's a technical observation, but you'd also need to have like something on the blockchain or something just to validate that the image or this media has the same provenance with everybody else, and like that's the right one, right?
Yeah, there are some people, we're trying not to pick winners exactly, but this one is not blockchain based. It's more centralized certificate authority based. And I know some people like that and some people don't like that. I think it's a trade-off the industry is going to have to figure out.
Gotcha.
Great comment, though. You're thinking exactly the right directions. Other thoughts, comments?
We
Great.
are really pushing the hour. I'll probably express everyone's opinion. That was really good discussion, and